The rain hadn't let up in 3 days. Caleb Whitmore noticed the puddles first, deep brown pools spreading across the gravel lot of the Harmon County Fairgrounds, where the annual Harvest Festival had packed up and left 2 days early. He'd driven out here because his assistant had scheduled a walkthrough of the venue for a potential corporate event, and his assistant had forgotten to cancel it, and now Caleb Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Agricultural Holdings, a man whose name appeared on the side of grain silos in 4 states, was standing alone in an empty parking lot at 6 in the evening, watching his Italian leather shoes sink slowly into the mud. He turned back toward his car. That was when he heard it, a sound, low, almost swallowed by the rain. He stopped walking. There it was again, a small, wet, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles on metal, coming from behind the row of old storage trailers lined along the back fence. Any reasonable person would have gotten in their car and driven away. Caleb had built a reasonable life. He knew how to make sensible decisions. He'd grown Whitmore Holdings from a regional grain operation into a $2 billion agricultural empire by never doing anything impulsive. He walked toward the trailers. The tapping grew louder, desperate. One trailer near the end, rusted green, padlocked, shook slightly as something inside threw itself against the wall. "Hello," Caleb called out. The tapping stopped. Then, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Someone was in there. He looked around the empty lot. No security, no other cars. Just the rain and the mud, and a locked trailer trembling in the dark. Caleb Whitmore was not a man who carried bolt cutters, but he was a man who owned a construction equipment company as a subsidiary, and in the back of his Range Rover, his site manager had left a toolbox from last Tuesday's property inspection. It took him 11 minutes to get the lock off. The door swung open and a smell hit him. Stale air, motor oil, fear. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. A boy stared back at him. He was small, couldn't have been more than 11 years old, curled against the far wall of the trailer with his knees pulled to his chest and his wrists zip-tied together in front of him. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. His left eye was swollen nearly shut. He was shaking so hard his teeth chattered, and even through all of that, through the fear and the bruising and the zip ties and the dark, the boy looked straight at Caleb and did not look away. "You're okay," Caleb said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I've got you. You're okay." The boy's name was Danny Ferris. He was 10 years old. He lived with his grandmother, June, in a double-wide on the south edge of Harmon County, on a strip of land that had belonged to the Ferris family since Danny's grandfather had bought it for $3,000 in 1971. June Ferris grew a vegetable garden and kept 4 chickens and drove a 2003 Pontiac that leaked oil on the driveway. She made Danny's school lunches herself, a sandwich, an apple, 3 crackers, because the cafeteria cost $2.50 a day and $2.50 added up. The sheriff's department arrived within 9 minutes of Caleb's call, an ambulance 3 minutes after that. Danny was wrapped in a thermal blanket and loaded into the ambulance while a deputy took Caleb's statement in the rain. "He say anything to you?" the deputy asked. "He said he'd been in there since yesterday morning," Caleb said. "Someone grabbed him walking home from school. He doesn't know who, or he says he doesn't know." The deputy wrote something down. "And you just happened to be here. I had a meeting scheduled at an empty fairground." It was a scheduling error. The deputy looked at him for a moment, then back at his notepad. Well, lucky scheduling error. Caleb drove home that night and sat in his kitchen for a long time without turning on any lights. He told himself that was the end of it. He'd done what any decent person would have done. He'd made the call, he'd waited for the paramedics, he'd given his statement. The boy would be fine. The boy had a grandmother. This was not his story to be part of. He went to bed. He didn't sleep. At 7 the next morning, he called the Harmon County Sheriff's Department and asked which hospital they'd taken the boy to. He arrived at Harmon Regional Medical Center with a stuffed bear he'd bought from the gift shop in the lobby, which he immediately felt foolish about because the boy was 10 and 10-year-olds didn't want stuffed bears, and a bag of chips from the vending machine, which he felt better about. June Ferris met him in the hallway outside Danny's room. She was 71 years old, with short white hair and the particular posture of a woman who had spent decades refusing to let hardship fold her in half. She was wearing a house dress she'd clearly slept in, and she was holding a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She looked at Caleb for a moment, measuring him. "You're the one who found him," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they're trying not to cry in front of a stranger. "He has a cracked rib," she said, "and the eye. And they want to keep him overnight to watch for a concussion." She paused. "He's going to be fine." "I know," Caleb said, though he hadn't known. He'd spent most of the night not knowing. He held out the chips. "I didn't know what he liked." June Ferris looked at the chips. Something moved across her face, something old and tired and grateful all at once. "He likes those," she said quietly. "The sour cream ones. They were the sour cream ones. He didn't know why he'd picked them. He just had." Caleb saw Danny twice more at the hospital. Once that afternoon, when the boy was awake and propped up on pillows watching cartoons, and once the next morning when he was being discharged. Both times Danny watched him with those same steady eyes, the ones that didn't look away. Most kids, when they'd been through something frightening, looked everywhere but at you. Danny looked right at him. "Does it hurt?" Caleb asked, gesturing at the eye. "Yeah," Danny said, "but not as much as yesterday." "That's good. Are you rich?" Caleb blinked. "Why do you ask that?" Danny shrugged, careful of his rib. "Your car, and your shoes, even the muddy ones." Caleb almost smiled. "I do okay. Grandma June says you can tell a lot about a person by how they treat someone who can't do anything for them," Danny said. He said it, the way kids said things that adults had told them, carefully like carrying something fragile. "She says most rich people don't stop." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like a smart woman." "She's the smartest person I know," Danny said, simply, no performance in it. Caleb drove home thinking about that. He told himself he wasn't going to get involved. He had a company. He had board meetings and quarterly reports and a property dispute in Nebraska that had been dragging on for 14 months. He had things that required his attention, but he knew things now that he hadn't known before. He knew that June Ferris's roof had a tarp over one corner because she couldn't afford to have it fixed before winter. He'd noticed it when he pulled into the driveway. He knew that Danny walked 1.5 miles to the bus stop every morning in the dark, because June had mentioned it when she thought he wasn't listening. He knew that the school Danny attended had lost its after-school tutoring program in the last budget cuts, and that Danny had been supposed to get extra help in math this semester, and now he wouldn't. He knew these things because he'd been paying attention. He drove past the Ferris property on a Saturday in October, slow enough to read the address off the mailbox. He told himself he was just checking that the tarp hadn't blown off in the recent wind. It hadn't, but there was a new tarp, brighter blue, weighted down differently, like someone who knew what they were doing had put it there. He found out later, much later, that a local roofing company had called June Ferris and told her the repair had been paid for anonymously. She'd cried on the phone. The man who told Caleb this was his own accountant, who had processed the payment without asking questions because he had learned, over 17 years, not to ask Caleb Whitmore questions when he had that particular look on his face. Caleb enrolled Danny in a private tutoring program run through the county library. He arranged it through the Library Foundation, a donation he'd made anyway, so that the tutoring was offered to several children, and Danny was simply among them. He was meticulous about this. He didn't want June Ferris to feel like charity. He didn't want Danny to feel like a project. He just wanted the boy to get his math help. He didn't see Danny again until February. He was at the Harmon County Diner, the one on Route 9 that made the kind of eggs nobody could replicate in a kitchen, when he looked up from his coffee and saw a boy in a winter coat that was slightly too large sitting across the room with an older woman in a blue cardigan. Danny looked up at the same moment. His good eye, both eyes were fine now, healed completely, went wide with recognition. And then, before June Ferris could say a word, Danny had slid out of the booth and was crossing the diner. "You're here," he said. "I eat here sometimes," Caleb said. "We never eat out," Danny said, with the unfiltered honesty of a 10-year-old. "Grandma June said today was special. What's special about today?" Danny held up a paper, a math test. At the top, in red pen, 94-100. "I passed. First time this year." Caleb looked at the paper for a long moment. Something happened in his chest that he didn't have a name for immediately. It took him a minute to identify it as pride, which made no sense. Danny wasn't his. He had no right to feel proud. He felt it anyway. "That's excellent," he said. "The tutor says I'm catching up fast," Danny said. She says I just needed someone to slow down and explain it right. She sounds good at her job. She is. Danny tilted his head. Were you the one who got me in the program? Caleb looked at him. What makes you ask that? Danny just looked back. Steady. Waiting. You're perceptive, Caleb said finally. Grandma June says that means I notice things. It does. I notice things, Danny agreed, and left it at that. By the time June Ferris made her way over, slower than Danny, hands wrapped around a coffee mug, eyes reading the scene carefully, Caleb had already moved over in his booth to make room. She sat across from him, looked at him the same way she had in the hospital hallway, measuring. You've been quiet about things, she said. I try to be. That's not how most people help, she said. Most people want you to know. Caleb didn't say anything. June wrapped both hands around her mug. Danny lost his parents when he was 4, she said, quietly, like she was telling him something she didn't tell easily. Car accident on the interstate. It was February, same as now, ice on the road. She paused. I've had him since. I wouldn't trade it. But I'm 71 and I have a bad hip and I can't give him everything he needs, and that's a hard thing for a grandmother to sit with. You've given him more than you know, Caleb said. You don't know that. I know what kind of boy he is, Caleb said. That came from somewhere. June Ferris was quiet. She looked out the window at the gray February sky. Then she looked back at him, and something in her had shifted slightly. Some wall that had been up since the hospital hallway had come down a few inches. He asks about you, she said, more than he probably knows he does. Caleb didn't answer that. He looked over at Danny, who had gone back to the other booth and was eating what appeared to be an enormous amount of pancakes. He eats like that at home too, June said, following his gaze. I don't know where it goes. Growing, Caleb said. Growing, she agreed. They sat in a comfortable quiet that Caleb hadn't expected. He was not a man who did comfortable quiet easily. He had spent 30 years filling silence with strategy. But this was different. Spring came and Danny started showing up at things. A county science fair. He'd made a project about soil erosion that won second place, and which he explained to Caleb in intense detail when Caleb happened to be there as a community sponsor. A little league game where he played left field with enormous seriousness and caught a fly ball that made June Ferris jump out of her folding chair. Caleb found himself going to these things. He didn't examine it too closely. He was a sponsor of community events. That was an existing part of his life. He just started attending more of them. In June, Danny asked him if he could see the inside of a grain silo. Why? Caleb asked. I want to know how they work, Danny said, the echo inside them, and how grain moves without spilling. Caleb took him to the Whitmore facility outside of town on a Saturday morning. Danny walked through the operation with his hands clasped behind his back like a small professor, asking questions that occasionally stumped the floor manager, who had been doing this for 22 years. He wanted to know about moisture content and aeration systems and why the steel was a particular gauge. You interested in agriculture? The floor manager asked him. Danny thought about it. I'm interested in systems, he said. How things connect. On the drive home, Danny fell asleep in the passenger seat with his head against the window. Caleb drove slower than he needed to. It was July when things shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. But Caleb had started to notice that when he came home to his house, the large, quiet house on the hill outside town, where he had lived alone for 11 years. Something about it felt different than it had before February. Not worse, just more noticeable. The way you only hear silence when you've recently been somewhere that wasn't silent. His lawyer called him one afternoon about an estate matter. In the course of that conversation, the lawyer mentioned carefully that Caleb had never updated his will after his divorce, that there was no designated beneficiary for the non-corporate holdings, that this was, legally speaking, a situation worth addressing. Caleb said he'd think about it. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he called his lawyer back. He did not mention Danny. He was not sure, yet, what he wanted to say, or whether he had the right to say anything at all. Danny had a grandmother. Danny had a family, however small. Caleb was a man who had found him in a trailer and bought him sour cream chips and anonymously fixed a roof, but he had also started understanding something over the past 8 months. Something he hadn't been able to name until one morning in July when he was standing in his kitchen making coffee and he realized he was looking forward to Saturday. Not to any meeting, not to any deal, To a 10-year-old boy asking him questions he didn't expect, that was something. He didn't know yet what to do with it, but it was something real. In August, Danny came to him with a letter. It was from a regional academic program, a 2-week summer residential for high-achieving middle schoolers interested in science and engineering. His tutor had nominated him. He'd been accepted. "It costs $400, Danny said. He said it flatly, in the voice of someone who has learned to state facts about money without letting them sting. Room and board and materials. Caleb looked at the letter, then at Danny. "Do you want to go?" "Yeah," Danny said, without hesitation. "Yeah, I really do." Caleb handed the letter back. "I'll take care of it." Danny started to say something, some version of "you don't have to" that June had probably raised him to say. Caleb cut him off gently. "You got in on your own. All I'm doing is making sure a door that should be open stays open. That's different from charity." He paused. "You understand the difference?" Danny was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah, I think I do." "Good." Danny went to the program. He came back 2 weeks later with a project on water filtration systems and a group of 3 friends from across the state who he emailed every week. He also came back different in some way that was hard to articulate. Some internal thing had clicked into place, like he had seen himself from the outside for the first time and recognized who he was. In September, Caleb had dinner with June Ferris, not at the diner. At her house, at her invitation, at a table she had set carefully with a cloth she'd ironed that afternoon. She made pot roast and green beans from her garden and a pie that she was modest about but was objectively extraordinary. After Danny had gone to bed, they sat at the table with the remainder of a bottle of wine June had opened for the occasion. "I need to ask you something," June said. "All right, what is it you want?" She asked it directly, the way old women who have lived long enough to value directness ask things. "From him. From this." She gestured at the table, at the evening, at all of it. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want anything from him," he said. "That's not." He stopped, started again. "I had a daughter," he said, and the sentence cost him something. He didn't talk about this. He never talked about this. She was born premature. She lived 9 days. He looked at his hands. "That was a long time ago. My marriage didn't survive it. Most of what I built after, the company, all of it, I built because I needed something to put my hands on. Something that would stay." June didn't say anything. She let him continue. "I'm not trying to replace anything," Caleb said. "I know that's not how any of this works. But Danny," he paused, "he's a remarkable person, and he deserves a full life, and I find that I want to help make sure he gets one. That's all. That's the whole of it." June looked at him for a long time. "He doesn't know about your daughter," she said. "No, maybe he should." Caleb looked up. "Not because you owe it to him," June said, "but because he carries things too. He thinks he's fine. He tells me he's fine." She wrapped her hands around her wine glass. "But he's 10 years old and he's never had a father, and he found someone who—" She stopped, looked out the dark window. "He needs to know that you're not going to disappear. He needs to know this is real." The thing about June Ferris was that she had spent 7 years raising a boy whose whole life had been defined by loss. She knew exactly what loss looked like from the outside when someone was trying to outrun it. She was right. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in the parking lot of the Whitmore facility, while they were waiting for the floor manager to unlock the side gate, Caleb told Danny about his daughter. He told it simply. No excess. Just the facts of it, that there had been a baby girl, that she had lived 9 days, that it had been the hardest thing he'd ever survived. Danny listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, Danny didn't say he was sorry, which was what most adults said and which meant almost nothing. Instead, he said, "What was her name?" Caleb hadn't expected that question. "Iris," he said, the name he almost never said out loud. Danny nodded. "That's a good name," he said, seriously, like it mattered. "I thought so too," Caleb said. They stood there in the parking lot for another minute. The floor manager appeared at the gate and waved them in. Danny started walking, then stopped. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Caleb," Caleb said. He'd been telling him this for months. "Caleb." Danny said it carefully, like he was making sure he meant it. "I'm glad you heard the tapping. The gate swung open, the day moved on. But that moment stayed. It stayed the way certain moments do. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just absolutely and permanently real. The kind of moment that marks a before and an after without needing to announce itself." By winter, Danny called him twice a week. By the following spring, He was spending Saturday afternoons at Caleb's house, doing homework at the kitchen table while Caleb worked at the other end, and this arrangement had developed so naturally that neither of them could have identified when it started. June Ferris watched all of it with the careful attention of a woman who had learned to hold things gently because she'd seen what happened when you held them too tight. She had conversations with Caleb that Danny didn't hear, honest conversations, sometimes hard ones about what this was and what it wasn't, and what it could responsibly become. She was not naive. She was not sentimental. She had loved her grandson fiercely through the hardest years of his life, and she would not hand that love to someone else carelessly, no matter how good that someone seemed. But she also knew, in the particular way that grandmothers know things, through observation and prayer and the slow accumulation of evidence, that Caleb Whitmore was not going anywhere. On a December evening when Danny was 11 and had recently beaten Caleb at chess for the first time and was not being modest about it, the three of them sat around the table in June's kitchen with the pot roast and the garden beans and the extraordinary pie. Danny talked about a new project he wanted to build, some kind of water management system he'd been sketching in his notebooks. He talked too fast and had to circle back twice to explain terms he'd assumed they'd know. June watched Caleb while Danny talked, watched the way Caleb leaned forward, watched the way he asked the right questions, not to seem interested but because he was, watched the way he looked at her grandson with the uncomplicated attention of someone who had nowhere else they'd rather be. She looked down at her plate. Some things didn't need to be fixed or explained or even named. Some things just needed to be shown up for, consistently, day after day, in the small ordinary ways that were the only ways that ever really mattered. Outside, the first snow of the season was coming down over Harmon County, covering the gravel lots and the vegetable gardens and the grazing silos and the double wide on the south edge of town, covering everything equally, the way grace does when it finally arrives, quiet and without announcement and entirely without asking whether you deserve it.